Hello and welcome to this Constitution Unit seminar on attitudes to democracy in the UK. I'm Meg Russell and I'm the Director of the Constitution Unit, and I'm going to be chairing today's panel. We're here to discuss the findings from our Democracy in the UK After Brexit project, which has just produced this rather beautiful report. The project comprises two parts. One is a very large public survey on attitudes to democracy, and we also have held a citizens' assembly on democracy in the UK. Our findings are very timely. There's so much controversy politically going on at the moment that we're finding that our findings, particularly on honesty and integrity in politics and on the roles and powers and responsibilities of the different branches of government, getting quoted quite a lot. Only this morning, the former Prime Minister, John Major, quoted our results in the major speech that he made on the state of democracy in the UK and around the world. We're here today primarily to talk about the survey part of the project. And we're joined by two fantastic guest public opinion experts to respond to the results. You'll be able to find lots of information about the project and the results on our website. I think some of those will go into the chat during the course of the event. There was a very nice piece on our blog today summarising the polling results and how they relate to some previous polling results, which I'm sure is going to be a significant topic for the discussion today. So let me introduce the panel. We're going to start with my Constitution Unit colleague, the Deputy Director, Professor Alan Renwick, who is the leader of the Democracy in the UK After Brexit project. He'll talk for about 10 minutes, just summarising some of the polling findings. He'll then be followed by Dr. Paula Surridge, who is a senior lecturer in political sociology at the University of Bristol, and the Deputy Director of the august institution, which I'm also part of, the UK and a Changing Europe, run out of King's College London. And then our second respondent will be James Johnson, who is the founder of JL Partners and a former senior opinion research and strategy advisor to Prime Minister Theresa May. Each of them will just give about 5 minutes of reflections on the findings after Alan has spoken. Once we've had our three presenters speak, we'll have a bit of discussion amongst ourselves as a panel, and then we'll open it up to you, the audience, for a Q&A. If you've got a question that you'd like to put to the panel, please write it in the Q&A function of Zoom as opposed to the chat. And my colleague on screen here, James Cleaver, is going to act as our Q&A facilitator. James, I should say, is the research assistant on the Democracy in the UK After Brexit project and is as steeped in these results as anybody could be. And it was his blog that went up this morning. James will select from the questions that you submit. And I think we're asking people to ask their own question. Yeah. So we will, by default, invite you to ask your own question, to unmute yourself and ask it to the panel. But if you'd rather not ask it yourself, you can be completely anonymous, or you can be named and ask James to ask it on your behalf. This whole event, including the Q&A part, is being recorded and it will be posted online on our various channels afterwards, our website, YouTube channel, and it will form a Constitution Unit podcast. So you may want to bear that in mind when deciding whether to name yourself and ask your own question. So that's plenty of introduction from me. Let me pass over to the panel, starting with Alan.
Great, thank you very much, Meg, and great to see so many people here today. So I've got 10 minutes. I'm not going to attempt to summarize the entire report. It's quite a short report, but there's nevertheless quite a lot in it. So I'm going to highlight a few of the key findings. And I'm doing this on behalf of all of my co-authors of the report, whom you can see there. So you've already seen Meg and James, and Ben Lauderdale is the real stats expert in the team. And he is in the audience today and ready to answer any particularly difficult questions about the analysis of the results. So a quick word firstly on the research project itself. So as Meg said, we're exploring attitudes to democracy in the UK today, and thinking about this particularly in light of some of the tensions that have arisen and many of the difficult questions that have arisen about how our democratic system in the UK should function over recent years. So questions about the proper relationship between government and parliament, the role of the courts, the role of referendums, other ways in which people can get involved in politics, and also, of course, as Meg said, questions about integrity and the culture of politics as well. As Meg mentioned, there have been two aspects to the project so far. The survey that we're talking about today, which was conducted last summer, and it's important just to remember that it was conducted last summer when we're looking at some of the findings. It was conducted before the Owen Paterson affair, before the Partygate issue arose, when concern about integrity of politics, you might think, would have been rather lower. So big UK-wide sample of 6,500 people in the survey fielded last summer. As Meg mentioned, we've also done a citizens' assembly, which met over 6 weekends in the autumn. And we haven't yet presented the full results of that, but we have presented some initial conclusions from that. And I think James will post the link to the initial findings from the Citizens' Assembly in the chat. I should say there's also a third element to the project, which is that we will be doing another survey later this year, following up with some of the people whom we surveyed last summer. And I'm mentioning that particularly because we're currently thinking about what we want to put into that survey. We'll be repeating some questions, we'll be asking some new questions, and I'll be very interested to hear the feedback from Paula and James and from others in the audience today about what we ought to be focusing on in that survey. Okay, so on to the findings from the report. And so the full findings, of course, are in the report itself. And again, the link for that is, I think, already in the chat. So three key findings that I'll just quickly go through. Firstly, most people express broad satisfaction with democracy, but they have very little trust in politicians. Second, most people wanted politicians who are honest, have integrity, and operate within the rules. And thirdly, people generally preferred not to concentrate power in the hands of a few politicians, but to spread it around and ensure that checks and balances are operating. So on trust, many surveys have found similar results. I won't dwell on this for long. But this was one of the questions, and in fact, the one that John Major cited this morning. To what extent do you trust or distrust each of the following to act in the best interest of the people of the UK? And you can see from strongly trust in the strong orange colour on the left through to strongly distrust in the magenta on the right. So trust is lowest in the Prime Minister, also pretty low in Parliament as a whole, somewhat higher in the civil service and significantly higher in the court system. And that's important backdrop when we're looking at the other findings. On integrity in politics, so this was one of the questions that we asked. Is it more important for a politician to have one characteristic or another characteristic? Each respondent saw two of the possible characteristics randomly selected from the list there. And Ben has then done his statistics in order to put it all together. And the key point there is being honest and owning up when we make mistakes, when they make mistakes, clearly come top. And remember, this was last July. This was not just people's responses in the current context. We also asked people to imagine that a future Prime Minister has to choose between some form of integrity and some form of delivery. We varied what we said in terms of the forms of integrity and delivery. And in the chart here, I've aggregated across the various different forms of delivery, but you can see the different forms of integrity, so acting honestly, acting within the law, acting transparently. And you can see that certainly with some of those, and for the total across, if you aggregate across the different forms of integrity, people seemed to value integrity ahead of delivery. Some people have said in response to the report that, well, they said that, but the country voted for Boris Johnson in 2019. So clearly that people don't really mean this. So I guess that is the thought that people might be telling us what they'd like to be true of themselves, that they want to be the sorts of people who stand up for integrity, but actually when push comes to shove, they don't necessarily do that. There are, however, other interpretations of what is going on there, which we might want to get into. So I'm not sure I buy that kind of explanation for what's going on there. We asked various questions where we asked respondents to choose between different statements. One of them was this one here. So healthy democracy requires that politicians always act within the rules, versus healthy democracy means getting things done, even if that sometimes requires politicians to break the rules. And you can see 75% chose the first of those statements against 6% who chose the second. So a huge difference in the response to that question. Then finally, the third theme is around maintaining checks and balances. And we explored this in relation to many different aspects of the political system. I'll just highlight a couple. So one was on the role of judges. We asked quite a complicated question here. I won't attempt to go through the full detail of it. It's all in the report. But essentially what it says is that a large majority of people think that the courts should have a role in upholding rights, whatever right it is that we're talking about. And only quite a small minority of people, those who are in the strong magenta color there, who think the courts should not have such a role. We also asked, please imagine that there's a dispute over whether the government has legal authority to decide a particular matter on its own, or whether it needs Parliament's approval, and how should this dispute be settled? And we tried different ways of wording this question to see if we use wording that is really kind of anti-judge. We highlight the fact that judges are unelected, whereas politicians are elected. Do we change people's views? And we can see that the wording does matter. Which indicates that lots of people maybe don't have settled views on this kind of issue. But whatever wording we use, there's strong support for the idea that judges should be involved in deciding these matters, which I think is quite striking and maybe goes against a lot of the wider discourse that we have on these issues. We also asked a question about whether whether civil servants should be neutral and permanent government employees or appointed by the government of the day, and a large majority favoured their being neutral and permanent government employees. Then finally, with regard to the role of the public in the democratic process, we asked a very general question: how much influence do you think people like you have on how the UK is governed? And the vast majority of people thought people like them had either far too little influence or somewhat too little influence. Very, very few people thought people like them had too much influence. But when we tried to pin down just how people should have more influence, then we didn't get such clear results. So we asked about referendums, and we asked about whether referendums should be used in a variety of different issues. And you can see the proportion in the lighter orange color on the left, who said that referendums should be used for deciding these issues. And people wanted referendums on issues where referendums have been used in the past, on whether we should rejoin the EU, what the voting system should be. Also a majority for referendum on assisted dying, but much lower support for referendums on other issues. And there are some people who want a referendum on anything, clearly, but much lower support for referendums there. We also asked about citizens' assemblies, which of course have become increasingly prominent as ways of bringing people into more deliberative ways of doing democracy. And we described what a citizens' assembly is, and then asked to what extent would you support or oppose having this kind of citizens' assembly become part of how the UK decides difficult political issues. And you can see majority support for having citizens' assemblies. Very few people opposed having citizens' assemblies, but quite a few people clearly don't really know. Maybe they haven't heard about citizens' assemblies before, so they don't have a particularly clear view. So in these questions, and also in some other questions that are in the report, and indeed some questions that we didn't manage to fit into the report, we didn't manage to kind of capture a view on how people do want to be involved in politics. Whether there are other things we should be asking about is an interesting question, and maybe people will have thoughts about that. But that's where I will wrap it up for today, for this.
Thank you, Alan. That was a wonderful whistle-stop tour of some of the most important results. And I would remind the audience that all of those graphics, alongside some commentary going beyond some of what Alan has said, can be found in the report, and the report is freely downloadable from our website. So now we're going to turn to our respondents, starting with Paula Surridge. Paula, what did you make of these results?
Thanks, Meg. So first of all, thank you for inviting me to the seminar. I'd already looked over, been following the research anyway, but to have the opportunity to look at it in even more detail, or the reason to look at it in even more detail, is really nice. And the research itself just couldn't be more timely, despite the data being from quite some time ago. The findings nevertheless are resonating very much with what's going on at the moment. And very much like some of the focus group research where UK and a Change in Europe released earlier this week, it shows how there's so many issues that are now making headlines that were already part of public perceptions long before they'd become this kind of focus of concern. So here you've got these concerns of integrity and honesty. We picked up concerns about the cost of living. So, to coin a phrase, long before they became part of the cut and thrust of politics, they were already part of people's concerns about politics and democracy. And I think some people have kind of pushed away some of the findings because they became from before, pre-Partygate. We've talked about pre and post Brexit. Maybe we're going to start talking about pre and post Partygate at some point. But I think actually these research findings from before that give us really strong clues as to why those accusations of corruption, rule breaking, and not always being entirely truthful have actually been so potent, because of what was already there in people's perceptions of politics. I was particularly interested in looking at the findings in terms of the relationship between the broader public and politics, and how they see their role and want to engage in and with politics. And a few points that I wanted to draw out on that. There's a really strong sense in the report that politicians should be accountable to the people. And this was expressed really strongly as a desire to be able to get rid of people who weren't doing a good job, and a majority of support for people thinking that MPs needed to follow the will of their constituents, which is an interesting idea within our democracy, and with the kind of parliamentary whip system being quite prominently in the news at the moment. I think there was also, and Alan just highlighted it there in one of the slides, a broad sense of what the democratic norms have been in terms of referendums and broad support for them. But then this kind of surprisingly nuanced view from the public, where they were happy to see experts making decisions on new drugs, where they wanted to see a mix of groups feeding into issues like social care, and then where they wanted the people to be in charge on the bigger constitutional decisions around the EU, but also around the voting system and so on. The other thing that I was really struck by, and this comes through in all sorts of data sets, every data set I ever look at, this strong sense that people say people like them, and that in itself begs some questions about who they think people like them are, but they say people like them don't have enough of a voice in politics. And this became quite a big issue after the 2016 referendum, that it fed into this idea of kind of left behind places and people not having a say in politics and so on, and wanting to use the referendum as a way of having that voice. But then on the flip side of that, the results also seem to suggest that people are not desperately wanting to be directly involved in politics themselves. They don't see being involved in their local communities as a key part of the democratic process. So I think for future research, it would be really interesting to unpack that tension a little bit, especially as this idea of devolving local power and local decision making has become quite prominent within the idea of levelling up. It's becoming part of that whole package, that whole agenda. But I think without a really clear idea about what people want, what people are actually willing to participate in as part of that. And I think there's a danger that that agenda becomes driven by those that are politically engaged, who want to be politically engaged, but who actually might have very different ideas about democracy than those who actually like their politics done at arm's length. So there's a danger of the debate being driven by one particular group. So I think there's a real space now to open up some research about this idea of voice in politics. What do people mean when they say people like me don't have enough say? What would that say be? What do they want it to be? And really, what are they willing personally to do to achieve it? It's all very well to say you don't think you have a voice, but are you willing to actually take any action to have that voice? Or is there something you think somebody else should be doing? Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And James, obviously you also have a deep research background, but you come from a more political policy perspective, perhaps, than Paula. How does it look from where you're sitting, the results of this research?
Yeah, thank you, Megan. Any comments as well from Paula? I mean, it's a great report. Thank you very much for doing it. And I think the number that really comes out to me is near the end of the report, where you ask people to choose a set of statements related to democracy. 54% say that democracy is good so long as it delivers effective government, with only a third saying that democracy is always the best form of government. And if you add those two numbers up, it looks great. But if you look at that 1/3 number, that is, worryingly low. And I think it tells us that there is a warning sign in this report. And if people no longer think that their government is effective, if people no longer think it can be trusted, then clearly there is a danger to democracy. And I think that's really clear in this, the importance of trust and effectiveness. And certainly in my focus groups, and I know this research was from before Partygate, to use Paula's terms, which I'm sure will become common usage now as an acronym. In my focus groups since it have been very worrying on this front. People talk about Boris Johnson, people talk about their lack of trust in him, but we also increasingly see that moving into the wider sense of MPs in general, in terms of government and the wider Conservative Party. A quote from a focus group I did last week: people have lost faith, and the Conservatives have lost their standing, really, any faith that people have with them. In fact, all MPs, whoever which party they're from. So you get this sense coming through. It's not just about Boris; it's about the wider party and the wider political situation as well. And that is dangerous, because when trust erodes, there's obviously a potential that faith in democracy erodes as well. You get this sense of apathy coming through. The fewer the times that politicians take responsibility, then this wider apathy takes over. People just sort of shrug their shoulders and sort of throw up their hands and say, well, I'm done with them then. And this is one of the dangers of the last few weeks. The fact that Boris Johnson hasn't resigned over this issue has led lots of people in my focus groups to be quite surprised. They expected him to resign, perhaps in a way that we in the commentariat or the press might not have expected him to. And they were quite surprised that he didn't and didn't take responsibility. And their reaction to that is not really fury, but is more resignation. And it's that resignation, it's that shrug of the shoulders that is arguably more dangerous to that trust and that effectiveness, that trust in the effectiveness of democracy. It's another reason, I think, as well, why we need to be careful about that finding, which Paul alluded to there, where you get this general sense, to quote the report, that people want a democracy that runs well without their having to invest much time in it themselves. Now, on the face of it, that might sound like the perfect outcome for a democracy, but it's also dangerous. For the political theorists amongst the group, it's Benjamin Constant made this point. One of the greatest threats to democracy comes from within. If you have this apathy factor where people are not so engaged. Now, in some respects, recent events in the West have actually shown some comfort on that. Though things like referendums have caused more polarization, they also cause more energy. And there has been a higher turnout in elections, both in the UK and in the US. But that is also one of the dangers, I think, that the public perhaps want it both ways when they can't have it. A couple more points from me. Some good news in the report, I thought. It's not all negative. The numbers on judges, in terms of net approval of judges, including amongst Leave voters, I don't think we'd see those kind of figures in the US if we were asking the same sort of questions on the same sort of divides. So you see some good news there. And even on quite contentious topics, as Alan referred to, people still wanting judges to make that final decision. Equally, on scientists, very high levels of trust. If you went onto Twitter, you wouldn't think that was the case in the COVID sort of culture wars that you see on Twitter, but they do not exist in the wider public beyond the very limited number of people. And that is obviously also good news. Final couple of points from me before stopping. I think we also have to take with a pinch of salt some of the things that perhaps the public might be lying to us about in this report, or at least where we always need to follow up with the qualitative work and also just taking the public with a pinch of salt. They say they want delivery over honesty, But obviously, as this polling was taking place in June 2021, we had Wallpapergate, we had stories about sleaze. No doubt, many would say that we had a significant amount of dishonesty coming out of the government, and I think it's just that reminder that get things done is still very resonant with voters, and it would be interesting to see in particular how the Red Wall voters responded to those questions, whether it was any less or more so on prioritising integrity. It was Partygate that broke the dam of public fury on a lot of those issues. But if you think back to last year, I mean, my reading of Wallpapergate was that was a net positive for the Conservatives, because people thought Keir Starmer was playing party politics and they romped home in the local elections that very week. It was that Partygate that made those issues come to the fore. Now they're resonant, but of course, we can't always rely on the public to police the politicians. So fantastic report. Thank you very much for sharing it and for having me on. As I say, I think some bits of good news, but I think it shows you that in any country, and even in ours, the sort of the birthplace of democracy, you could argue, modern democracy, there are significant weaknesses, and driving up that trust and effectiveness is so key, and is one of the things that this report can help us do.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, James. And you remind me, I should have given a proper plug to some of your focus groups have gone quite viral on Twitter in recent weeks on people's attitudes to what's been going on in Downing Street and so on. So I would encourage people to look some of that up. And just to be fair, I maybe should also have mentioned that Paula had a very interesting report published earlier this week on attitudes in the Red Wall with UK and a Changing Europe. So there's lots of other very interesting stuff out there on public opinion. Do start sending in your questions. For the moment, we're just going to have a bit of a chat among ourselves on the panel. I shall throw some questions at each of you. But I think the fairest way to start might be by inviting Alan to respond to some key points that have been made by Paula. I mean, Paula and James. Paula mentions this sort of tension between the public not feeling involved enough, but not seeming to want to be involved, and how we can explore that a bit more. I mean, there's both how we can ask the questions to understand it more, but then there's also how we might be able to respond in policy terms, how policymakers might be able to respond. And the points that James is raising perhaps about apathy. And, I mean, that is a huge problem that is beyond one little research centre to resolve. But whether you've got any reflections on how what we might be able to do to resolve some of those feelings.
Yeah, those were great comments from you both. Thank you so much. And Paula's comments very much relate to a concept that is often thrown around in political science of stealth democracy and the stealth democrat, the person who wants to have voice but doesn't want to have to do anything about it, essentially. And it may well be that is part of what we're picking up here. And I mean, I'd be interested in Paula's thoughts actually on how we can dig further into this. I entirely agree with you that we do need to dig further into it. And so what we have coming up in this project is another survey, so another opportunity to ask people these kinds of questions. And can we get further into this through that kind of that's a kind of survey question. You suggested that we should be doing some qualitative work as well through focus groups, and maybe we need to team up with James in order to do some focus groups in order to try to dig into this issue, because clearly we can, in a focus group, simply try to get people to talk about, well, what does it mean for them to have voice? What would it look like to have voice? What are they thinking when they feel that they don't have enough voice? But whether we can get into that through a survey question, I'm not quite sure. I mean, it is some of the findings in the report that I didn't put into my little talk there are very striking on this. We had a question where we asked, this one here, if you've got the report in front of you, it's on page 8, where we asked people about a whole range of different aspects of democracy and asked them to say what they regarded as more or less important. And absolutely bottom of the list came that people are active in their local communities. Whereas top of the list came those in power. If those in power do a poor job, they can be voted out. So there's, there is quite strongly in, if you look at the full list, not just those two, this idea that there are the people in power, and if they're not doing a good job, we need to be able to get rid of them, but we don't necessarily want to be involved too much more than that. So I think it's a really difficult issue. And then in response to what James said, so I mean, you raised the thought at the end there that you used the strong word lying about about what respondents might be saying to us, and the thought that they might not be entirely truthful about whether they really do value honesty ahead of delivery. And you pointed out the potency of getting things done as rhetoric, which clearly that is very potent. But it strikes me that part of the explanation for that lies in exactly what you were talking about previously, namely the apathy and the sense that all politicians are the same. And if you don't see a difference between Boris Johnson and other politicians in the degree to which they're all liars, they're all spinning away and trying to manipulate us on the make for themselves, then why would it make a difference to how you vote, even if you really, really care about it? And I guess one of the things that most struck me about our Citizens' Assembly, where of course, we are listening to the members a great deal and hearing them talking about politics, is the degree to which they didn't differentiate between different politicians on the whole. I mean, some of course did very much, but for many, there were just a bunch of politicians who are all beyond hope. And if that's the case, then yeah, whether one of them might deliver more effectively is more likely to shape your vote. But it absolutely doesn't mean that you don't care about this stuff. And I think what comes across from this very strongly is the degree to which people do care about it. And even if it doesn't shape their vote, it shapes their perceptions of democracy as a whole and their willingness to engage in democracy. And if we don't find a way of sorting that out, then, as James is very much saying, we do have a real problem.
Thank you very much. Let me throw the same question to both of the two respondents, and then I'll invite Alan to come in afterwards to see whether there's anything he wants to add, because you might want to answer it in the same way. But you touched on this a tiny bit in what you said, but let me ask it very explicitly to you. Out of our results, what did you find sort of relatively unsurprising and in line with past results, in which case maybe that's a bit less interesting? What surprised you in what we found? Paula, would you like to start? I mean, maybe nothing surprised you. If so, say so.
So I've already mentioned the things that were very much in line with what we've seen before. The kind of not having a voice, generalized distrust, those kinds of things we see in lots of different research. But one thing I found curious in the research that you presented, which was different to what in terms of questions to what I've seen before, was this kind of distrust specifically of the Prime Minister, always ranking below, or ranking below the government and things. And I wondered, I found that interesting and surprising, especially given we're talking about data collected last July. I'd find it entirely surprising to get it now, but we're talking about data from a while ago. And I've sometimes sort of floated with the idea of Boris Johnson as a kind of Marmite politician. You either love him or you hate him, whereas you have some politicians where everybody's a bit kind of, well, they're okay. And so I wondered to what extent that was a result because of who was Prime Minister at the time, or whether it was a distrust of that as an office. And that I thought was something that was interesting and worth further investigation.
We discussed a lot when we were designing the survey whether you can conceivably tease those things apart. I think it's questionable whether you can, isn't it? James, what did you just think? Yeah, of course, and what, if anything, surprised you?
Well, I think the main thing that jumped out for me was surprising was the question on page 9 about Parliament and government. This question around basically asking the respondents, out of the Prime Minister, the government as a whole, MPs in the House of Commons as a whole, who do you think should decide on various things? And it's striking because although we have moved to a very Prime Minister focused way of doing government, both in terms of inside Number 10, in relation to Parliament, and in fact in regards to sort of the media presentation of the government as well, and how voters think. Very small numbers are saying the Prime Minister, and most see these things as being government as a whole, or being actually MPs in the House of Commons as a whole. And Anna's quite right that my previous language on the public lying to us is perhaps a little bit too strong, but it is another indication perhaps of where the public might not necessarily like it if they got it. Because if you remember back to that 2017 to 2019 Parliament, you did see a vast amount of Parliament being in control, and obviously that also leading to a vast amount of infighting and things that arguably impacted on trust and democracy. Even more so than a powerful Prime Minister would have. So that surprised me, actually, that the level of sort of interest in that parliamentary thing. It's another one I think we should need to take with a pinch of salt. One more thing very quickly on Alan's point in his comments about this, this trade-off between integrity and delivery, and how, in the 2019 election, very low levels of trust, actually, even in 2019 in Boris Johnson, to tell the truth, but also low levels of trust in Jeremy Corbyn, to tell the truth or to be consistent. So as Alan says, you went in with two politicians who were quite different on integrity, but very similar, sorry, on integrity. It may be that at the next election that looks very different. I, for one, do not think Boris Johnson will be leading the Conservatives in the next election. But if he were to, then that difference with Keir Starmer could be very strong indeed. With my political hat on, if I was advising the Labour Party, I would say, don't talk about integrity for integrity's sake, but actually fuse that to get things done. Don't view them as two separate categories, but bring them together. We can get things done because we're being honest about the challenges, because we're being straight with you about what's on the table, because we're being honest about what we can deliver. And you can see that there is a strength in the political line bringing those two things together rather than treating them as separate entities.
That's very interesting, partly because that's exactly where John Major started this morning. His opening remarks were about how politicians aren't straight with people about what can and can't be done, which I think is profoundly important. I think people feel let down by politics because politicians overpromise, and that's part of the problem. I want to bring Alan in, but since you've said if I was advising Labour, let me put the obvious question that I was going to put to you, which is if you were advising the Conservatives or perhaps the Prime Minister. They're probably two different things at this point in time. What do you think they should take from this poll?
Well, I think there's a lot of findings in here that suggest that Conservatives and the Prime Minister need to be sort of very careful with this public trust that is out there. It benefits nobody for public trust to be low, even if it might seem like there are short-term benefits to doing so. I think what I would say to the Conservative Party on this is that yes, although there are, we have this low level of trust, we have that finding that you've got in the report on politicians. I think I would say there are always moments to reset. There are always potential moments. The public are not completely consigned to apathy and sort of disillusionment. If you look in 2016 after the Brexit result, if you look in 2019 after the general election result, the mood in my focus groups, I'm sure Paula saw it as well, much more positive than it had been at other points. People still willing to give politicians a chance, and when they see somebody new. So I think there is a capacity amongst the British public for a renewal of this trust. We're not talking 100%. We're never going to be in a situation where people are singing the praises of politicians. I think even that might even be built into the British psyche, that there is a reluctance to do that. But there is an opportunity to have a bit of a trust reset, and I think the Conservative Party has had two of those moments now in the last few years, 2016 and 2019. And with the 2017 general election and with COVID and the response to it, the Conservatives have lost those moments. They may well have another one with a new leader. I think I would say, being able to capitalise on that moment, listening to people's concerns where they really matter, like things like immigration, and making sure to capture and act on the public's concerns that they feel have been ignored for far too long. Leading opinion, and leading a more sort of integrity focused, honesty focused government, and also, as you allude to, Meg, countering that sort of hyperbole and that sort of sense that everything can be fixed and outlandish promises. sort of owning up and really sort of trying to own that sort of debate. The problem with my final point on this, the problem with people taking on outlandish promises by politicians is that they can often fall into the trap of feeling of sounding condescending, like during the Brexit referendum from the Remain campaign, or just a bit bland, saying here are the facts, do something else. If somebody can capture a sort of almost a sort of anti-populist populism, saying these guys are misleading you, here's what the truth really is, and we've sort of got the goods to fix it, then that could be a very powerful message indeed. So yeah, I think the Conservatives have a huge opportunity, but I think you're right, the interests of the Conservative Party and the current Prime Minister no longer align.
Interesting. I said I would come to Alan with what surprised him in the results, and then Alan, I've got another question I'd like to ask you. So anything brief on that, and then I'll ask you the next one.
Judges. So so far as we can tell, no one's asked such detailed questions about the role of judges in the democratic system before. I mean, there are some questions out there that you can find from past polling, but there's surprisingly little, given how big an issue it has been. Going into this kind of depth. And yeah, I just really did not expect so much positive support for the role of judges. And as James mentioned, across all the various different rights that we could think of. We asked that question about the role of judges in relation to lots of different rights, because we were expecting to see that people would want judges to be protecting rights that people care about, the rights of women, the rights of pensioners, for example. So we had those on the list, and we were expecting that people would not be so supportive of judges protecting rights of terror suspects or asylum seekers. And there were some differences, but there were marginal differences. So yeah, that was, given the discourse we see in the newspapers on this issue, I found that quite surprising. Great, thank you. I'm going to try and squeeze in one or two further short questions to the panel, and then I'll go over to the questions from the audience. We're running until 2:15, by the way. I maybe should have said at the beginning. I noticed that there are a number of things popping up in chat. I think it would help us very much if you could put your questions in the Q&A function if they're things that you actually want put to the panel. We're going to interpret chat, I think, as just sort of a statement to the room. James Cleaver will invite you to ask your question if it's in the Q&A function. So just to clarify that. So Alan, one obvious question which hasn't really come up yet, which I think some people looking at the survey might, greet it with skepticism, because they'll say, well, yes, of course, that group of people would say that, wouldn't they? There's a question of, do you like Boris Johnson as Prime Minister or don't you? And are you a Conservative voter? Did you vote for Brexit? Is that colouring what you're saying? So I'd just be interested if you could reflect a little bit on how divided opinion was, because clearly on some of these things, there's virtually no division at all. That extraordinary one that you put up, where 75% of people want a politician who follows the rules, and only 6% say it's okay to break the rules sometimes in order to get things done. There's not much room for division. There's not much room for people who love Boris Johnson to be skewing those results. What about across the board on other things? Yeah, no, it's a good point. And there is some analysis of this in the report, and we will be doing lots more analysis of this in the coming months. So there are differences between people. So there are some people who are more in favour of a strong executive that isn't unduly fettered by courts and other kind of elite level actors, who are more in favour of referendums on the whole, more in favour of the majority having its way rather than protecting minority rights. And then there are some other people who have the kind of opposite perspectives on all of these things and are more in favour of spreading power out to a greater degree, having a more deliberative democratic process, protecting minority rights, and so on. And the people in the first category are more likely to have voted Leave and more likely to have voted Conservative in 2016 and 2019 respectively. And the people in the second category are more likely to have voted Remain and particularly Labour, but also Lib Dem, Green, SNP. But firstly, we shouldn't exaggerate those differences too much. So, there are lots of people who are kind of in the wrong category, as it were. So it's not as though there's an absolute mapping by any means. And secondly, there are lots of people who have quite mixed views. So most people will have some views, at least, that don't kind of fit into the categories that you might expect from that very simple picture that I've just laid out. And lots of people have very, very mixed views indeed, and are really quite conflicted between different conceptions of democracy. And then when we go to more specific questions, so as you've pointed out, that question where we have that stark 75% to 6% divide, there's clearly not much difference between different parts of the population there. But similarly, all of the groups within the population that we've looked at are net positive about courts. All of the groups in the population think that we should have a neutral civil service. So, when you look at specific questions, at least with some of them, again, where the balance lies is the same no matter what group you look at. So there are differences, but we just shouldn't exaggerate those differences and imagine that we have a kind of war of different visions of democracy going on in the country.
And it does seem quite striking that there aren't many questions on which those people who want to do battle with the courts or cut back checks and balances or bend the rules could take comfort in saying, well, yes, that's just a partisan answer. There's a whole bunch of people who want to support those institutions, but there's a whole bunch of people who don't, and they're our core vote, because it doesn't generally divide up like that, does it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And we have much more analysis to do. And one of the things that I'm interested in these conversations is hearing about what are the interesting further bits of analysis of the data that we should do. But so far, yes, I think that's a correct interpretation.
Let me ask one more question, because I think this is also a sort of slightly burning, slightly obvious question for people who've been watching the polling for a while and have read our results. That back in, and it relates rather to something that James Johnson said before about the mood during the embattled sort of Brexit times, from the referendum to actual Brexit, when the courts were dragged into controversy, Parliament was dragged into controversy, etc. There was a really striking result from the Hansard Society's audit of political engagement, which was in the field in late 2018, which found that a majority of people, 54%, supported having a strong leader who would break the rules. And now we've polled, we haven't asked that exact same question, but we've asked it in effect in different ways, and we see almost total rejection of that kind of model. Is this because of the way we ask the question, or is it an indication that something has changed? I mean, it's a very Brexity sort of question, I think. We were very divided on a lot of these things sort of two or 3 years ago. Is the country coming back together? Has something changed, or is it just the way we asked our question? James, would you like to go first, and then I'll go to Paula?
Yeah, just very quick on that. I mean, I think it's slightly, so it's interesting when you talk to people in focus groups about, well, I mean, this applies to just before Partygate, but the way that people would talk about Boris Johnson who are more positive. And they wouldn't sort of say, yeah, we like the fact he breaks the rules, but they would say, oh, I like the fact that he doesn't really mind who he offends to get things done, or I don't really mind, or oh, I quite like the way that he doesn't take any nonsense to get things done. And so although they're not explicitly, although those very same voters are exactly the type who will probably answer no, who would answer disagree to that survey question, if it's more soft and they feel that they can get, if it's a softer sort of formulation of words, then they might support that. And now they wouldn't back the breaking of the rules, but obviously, that could still be happening behind the scenes without it being that salient to those voters. Now, obviously, there is a limit that those voters take, and you saw that with the impact of Partygate. It was the very fact that broke the rules that turned people against Boris Johnson so much. But I do think that that there is something in this sort of, there is still appetite for a strong man in the UK yet. It might just be a slightly more sort of friendly proposition to people to support it.
Paula, what do you think? You've polled an awful lot about changes to public opinion as a result of Brexit. How do you read this?
Well, I happened earlier to look that question up because it occurred to me when I was reading the results about the PM. And so I looked it up on the British election study, so the wave that was conducted just before the election. And there it's just under a quarter who agree or strongly agree that they would like a strong leader who will break the rules. So the results are very much in line with what you're saying, you know, you're finding as well. There wasn't at that point this kind of appetite for somebody breaking the rules. And I think that's a really important part of that formulation. One of the things that I wrote about way back in kind of whenever it was, this whole of the last 2 years is just one big blob in my memory, but around the time of the Barnard Castle trip, I wrote about this and the fact that, you know, the two things that people don't like are people in positions of power or wealth using that to get around the rules and people breaking rules. And so these moments are almost designed perfectly to upset the groups of voters who would perhaps be most inclined to want a strong leader. So in that sense, it's kind of undermining some of that. But I think James's point is right. It's perhaps worth asking the question in such a way which talks about strength of leadership without directly linking it to breaking rules, because actually you get a lot of people who want strong leaders and are actually quite rule abiding and think rules are important as well.
Alan, do you want to add anything? Otherwise, we'll go to the questions from the audience.
I would just add that James Cleaver has some interesting analysis of this question in his blog post from this morning. So do read the blog post.
We're getting as many shameless plugs as we can. Can we invite James Cleaver onto the screen to give us some indication of audience questions?
Yes, thanks, Meg, and thanks for the questions. Keep on sending them in through the Q&A function. I'm going to start off with a pair that ask about what exactly the public priorities are, therefore from Sean Roberts and Unlock Democracy. So Sean first, please.
Yeah, so I mean, my question really is, I mean, we've had moments like this before, like after the expenses scandal just over a decade ago, where suddenly this, you know, trust in politicians was like, whoa, that's really big. And of course, that ultimately drifted away and perhaps wasn't necessarily didn't drive a lot of change. So the question really is trust in politics going to be a key issue at the next general election? And something that actually is debated in the election, might even be part of manifestos, part of people's priorities? Or do you think it's actually just going to drift back to cost of living, NHS jobs in the way that normally it does? So it's almost, have we reached a tipping point?
Really good, thank you. And Unlock Democracy.
That's me as well.
That's not you as well, Sean. That's Tom Brake from Unlock Democracy.
Hi, Tom.
Hi there. So my question was also on the question of trust. In the survey, did you detect that the lack of trust people were feeling in politicians actually fed through to people wanting some of the possible solutions to that problem implemented? And I would suggest PR might be part of that, those solutions, or is this something that perhaps requires further analysis in your second survey?
Great. Why don't I pass that one to Alan, because it's very precise about the survey, and then I'll ask Paula and James to come in on the other question about whether we're at a moment. Alan.
Good, thank you. I would say the survey didn't get into potential solutions on that issue. You mentioned PR as a potential solution there, which is quite interesting. Of course, one of the striking findings, which we've alluded to, is the degree to which people want those in power to be accountable. And of course, there is at least a strong tradition in the UK of thinking that accountability means that you have single party governments and you can vote them in and out easily. There are different views of accountability, which are more compatible with proportional voting systems, but anyone arguing for a proportional voting system will have to deal with that argument that a proportional system harms accountability. And given that, you know, we also see that people don't want the voting system to be changed without a referendum, that argument would really need to be made in order to go there. The Citizens' Assembly did explore potential responses to the trust concerns in a lot more detail. And so some of the findings from the Citizens' Assembly are about the importance of strengthening the standards system, the regulatory system. So we haven't released those fully yet, but in the spring we'll be setting out those results in detail. But there was very strong support for changing and strengthening that regulatory system.
Paula, would you like to come in first on that very interesting question from Sean about whether, is this a flash in the pan and we're going to have forgotten it by the election, or is it a turning point?
I think I'd perhaps challenge a little bit. Sean suggested that the expenses scandal just disappeared. I mean, it still gets picked up in popular discourse all the time when people are talking about, oh, they're all the same. You'll get those kinds of things about expenses coming up into the conversation. But I think in terms of trust in politics, where it's going to have the most influence at the next election is on turnout rather than on what's discussed and what goes in manifestos. So I think there's a real danger now that we've got voters who are not motivated to turn out because they just always support their party and it's in a kind of expressive thing. They're motivated to turn out for other reasons. And if they really buy into this, they're all the same, I voted for change and nothing has changed kind of narrative, the real danger is that actually turnout suffers quite dramatically at the next election.
And it strikes me just listening to this, which is probably, it's an obvious point, I guess, that these things cutting through, I think you're right about the expenses scandal. And one of the reasons that it cut through was because it was about such normal everyday things. Who was paying people's mortgages? Who was paying when they bought a new TV and that kind of thing? And people think, well, I bought my TV with my own money. And similarly, did you see your sister on her birthday? Did you have a group of friends around? Could you visit your mum when she was unwell? There's a resonance there, isn't there, with everyday lives that you don't get in a lot of political issues. James, what do you think? Turning point, flash in the pan.
I think that the personal resonance of the Partygate story definitely explains a lot of its impact. But I think that on trust itself, it tends not to have an impact at general elections for two reasons. One, because it's lower salience than some of those other big things like cost of living, who you want to run the economy, who you want to run the country, those big issue sort of questions. And also it tends to have a cancelling out effect. People tend to say, well, all politicians are as bad as each other, and that has an impact. But that's not to say that the event itself can't be important in future contests. And the interesting thing on Partygate is that even in the focus groups already, and in the Labour Party's messaging and what some Conservative MPs are saying, it's turned away from being about the issue in and of itself. It's turned away from being about trust and more about what it means for Boris Johnson's brand more generally. When I speak to voters now in the focus groups, the first breaking point of Partygate, it was all about the parties. But now it's more about, well, Margaret Thatcher wouldn't have let that happen in Downing Street. Maybe Boris Johnson isn't as strong as we thought. Boris Johnson has lied again and again to cover this up. Maybe he's not going to, maybe we can't trust anything he says. Boris Johnson is, infighting with all of his MPs. Maybe he won't be able to deliver what we want in our local area that we were promised in 2019. So it's becoming a wider problem of delivery and effectiveness, not just trust. And that's when it really can resonate at a general election. And that's why I think that, electorally, Boris Johnson's brand is in very difficult territory, if not unrecoverable, because everywhere he goes now, everything he says, every time he goes on TV, that's the response he will get. When I say the words Boris Johnson in my focus groups now, I don't really get anger, I get laughter and derision. People just laugh. And that's when you know that a politician's stock is problematic, because nothing they say can be taken, it gets taken seriously. Look, maybe there is a big event that will happen that will mean Boris Johnson can turn it around, but without that, I think that is the problem that continues, and that's why Partygate's electoral ramifications are going to continue way beyond the parties fading from the news.
I suppose just to throw in another reminder that the poll results that we're talking about today are from a poll that was conducted last summer before any of this happened. And so if we were to repeat it now, you'd probably get even stronger responses where there's space for that on the graph on some of these questions. James, we should go to another round, and don't forget, everybody, that we're looking for ideas for our next survey. So feel free to propose them. And feel free, panelists, to sneak in your suggestions in your answers to the questions over the next 15 minutes. James, what have you got?
Thank you. So I have another pair of questions from Isabella Roberts and Peter Lloyd, both of which are sort of asking for further interpretation of the results of the survey. So Isabella.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for doing the survey and walking through it with us today. I just want to pick up on a point that I think Professor Alan Renwick mentioned just now. So I ran for the London Assembly last year for the Londependence Party, which all was, towards the cause of further devolution of powers to the regions, not only just to London, but the other regions across the rest of the UK. So the results on page 8, where the bottom sort of factor that people are active in their local communities, the respondents found that to be the least important in an active democracy. I found that quite surprising. And actually the bottom 3 altogether of people actively support the cause they care about, or people are free to join or organize pressure groups, and then ending with active in their local communities, those 3 seem to be the most grassroots cause campaigning that people can actively be involved with. So maybe that's to your point, that people want to make sure that democracy is working with the least intervention on their part. So just wondered if you had any more further thoughts on that.
Okay, great, thank you. And Peter.
Yes, thank you. I haven't read the report yet, but my first question is, was there any indication of concern about how policies are made?
Okay, that's a very precise question. Alan, would you like to pick up, and then I would invite the other 2 to come in if they wish, particularly on this point. It touches some of the things Paula was saying before, Isabella's question about people's ranking of the importance of different characteristics of democracy and ranking those things quite low. Alan.
Thank you. I think Isabella has illustrated that there is further evidence beyond what I managed to squeeze into my presentation about this kind of paradox, if you like, that people want to have more voice, but they don't want to be actively involved in order to get that voice. And I think your interpretation of that graph is exactly right. And I found it very, very striking when I looked at it as well, that all of those forms of people getting involved in various different ways are right at the bottom of the graph. And it's pretty dispiriting if you are enthusiastic for a more active participatory kind of democracy.
Maybe it's important to take into account the way the question was asked, because we were asking people to choose between things, weren't we? So we're sort of effectively asking people to choose between 2 good things potentially. Mm-hmm. So they're not saying we hate local involvement, they're saying that they rank something else higher than local involvement, which is slightly different.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely fair. Yes.
So they want politicians to be voted out if they do a poor job. They rank that high, and they might rank it higher than some of the things that Isabella mentioned, but it doesn't mean they don't want those things too.
Yeah,
it's something that our survey doesn't really get at very thoroughly.
Yeah, and that's a good point, and it's maybe something where we can think about, and we have a relative ranking of these various different things from the question that we did, and whether we can get at some kind of absolute measure of importance in the second survey is perhaps something to be considered. Just on Peter's question, I guess it depends what you mean by how policies are made. If by that you mean processes kind of within government, processes of consultation, we didn't really open up that black box, if you like, terribly much. And I think for most voters, it is a black box. And again, I think the experience from the Citizens' Assembly is very much that, the sorts of people who come to a seminar like this are probably going to be quite surprised by the degree to which many people from the wider population, not all, but many people from the wider population, feel so extraordinarily alienated from and distant from what happens in the corridors of power. And they just have no idea, really, of what's going on there. So the questions that we did ask are about, the role of Parliament in the policy-making process, for example, the role of courts in checking the policy-making process, the role of civil servants, and as I've said, people were very clear that they did want civil servants to be neutral. They did want, as James has highlighted, Parliament to play an important part. So these were the kind of more general aspects, I guess, that we did ask about.
Paula, would you like to come in? And in particular, this could be an opportunity for you to start shaping the questions on this in the next survey, because maybe it is partly about how the question was asked, actually.
Well, I think that's a factor, obviously, because the question is asked in a very specific way. But if you were to compare, for for example, some of the figures I used when I did the slot for the Citizens' Assembly on types of political participation, once you get past voting in a general election, all types of political participation are done by a minority, and that minority is really quite small for these very active forms of participation, protesting, giving money to parties, those it's a tiny fraction of the population who do those things. So maybe one thing to do is to perhaps even take that list and expand it, or think of other ways people are involved in their local communities to try and get a measure of how involved people are, and perhaps even with an option there is not involved but would like to be, so that you get a sense of whether or not that people actually want to be. I think another way into this is to also break some of these results down by political interest, to see how much difference there is between groups who are politically interested. I think it was Isabella who was kind of involved in campaigning. So the differences between those groups that are really interested in and that are driving the agenda, and those groups who are paying less attention, if any, to politics, but also may still have ideas about what they think democracy should be like.
James, any additional thoughts before we go back to the questioners?
Nothing major to add, just a very quick point on how policy is formed. You know, in the focus groups, in the research, you do get a bit more of the conspiratorial stuff coming through than perhaps you might have had 5 years ago. You know, whether it's are the media and government in cahoots on some of this stuff. If you think back to the fuel crisis in the summer, you know, lots of comments in focus groups about that possibly being some sort of, you know, stitch up to sell excess fuel. They don't register massively in polling, but it's quite interesting when you have a focus group, because somebody says it and then you actually don't see people recoiling against it. They're sort of, you know, nodding along and perhaps internalizing themselves. So that's one thing to watch out for as well, I think.
Thank you. James Cleaver, what else have you got?
So we've got a round of 3 questions here from Will Matchbull, Brian Walker and Christina Borrell. Will and Brian are sort of hinting at different avenues of future research, and Christine has a more technical question that maybe Ben Lauderdale will be best placed to answer.
Okay, great. Will, go ahead.
Hi, so my question's really about addressing the concern in some quarters with judicial legislation, particularly in the context of the current human rights consultation. So it's really interesting to see the data on the questions about the judiciary. But do you think, if we ask further questions, there might be an appetite for greater democratic input in determining what the rights should be in the first place, rather than just how they should be upheld once they're determined?
Interesting. Brian?
Why not look at things at the other end of the telescope? Look at, for example, what activists actually think, proven activists who are expressing their views to MPs through what we used to call the post bag, that is emails and social media. I mean, MPs are quoting all the time about how they're influenced by public opinion. I can imagine how difficult it would be to survey it, but it might be largely anecdotal. But nonetheless, what are the emails telling us, and what influence will MPs admit to having on their own opinions and actions? I think this is, given all the frustrations that I'm hearing today about the objective measurements of public opinion generally, it might be quite useful to try this.
It would be fascinating to be able to survey the views of those who write to their MPs versus the views of those who don't, but tricky. Christine.
Yes, I'd just like to know more about the representativeness of the YouGov sample, given that it's done online, and therefore, of course, it excludes those people who, for one reason or another, aren't able to do an online survey. And this may be because they don't have internet access at all, or because they do, but they can't afford or don't want to use it for that purpose. So there's a potential skew there. And also, it's well known that YouGov samples do pretty poorly represent people from ethnic minorities. They've always had this problem, and as I understand it, it's still a problem. So any comments about the effect of that on your results and ways of mitigating in your future research?
That could be a handy excuse to bring our co-investigator Ben Lauderdale onto the screen to say hello to everybody. But Alan, you have a think about that, and I'll start with the respondents and come back to the project team at the end. James Johnson, you may have thoughts about the representativeness of MPs postbags and that kind of thing, and the judicial point from Will as well is very interesting.
Yeah, it's activist point is certainly interesting, and I think MPs are certainly in the sort of in the email era that we've really been in for about 15-20 years now. They've got very good at discerning between what is an organized campaign, where people sort of click on a link that they're sent and it auto generates a letter or an email, and sort of homegrown anger, I suppose, where people get in touch. Now, I think the email campaign link was a very effective tool in the early days of it, but as I say, MPs are quite discerning now, and they're able to sort of that those things tend to get spotted and therefore given less of a priority. But that homegrown anger really does get picked up, really does get registered, and I think we saw that with Dominic Cummings' trip to Barnard Castle, where lots of MPs had full postbags or email inboxes over that issue, and you saw that leading to, I think it was 100 MPs in the end calling for him to resign. And then you've seen it most recently with Partygate, where you've seen a lot of those MPs staying quiet when it first came out, going back for the weekend to their constituencies, both hearing from their voters, but also getting that amount of posts and emails in. So I think when it's sort of that authentic, genuine outburst of anger, it still really does. It certainly does make an impact. And I think that for MPs, it's almost as important as the public polling findings.
Of course, we've had the leader of the House of Commons, the new leader of the House of Commons, was reported on the BBC today saying ordinary people don't care about this. But I think, James, you would dispute that, wouldn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I said on Twitter yesterday, not only is that incorrect. I mean, do any poll. I mean, we did a poll last week, and found that the majority of people disagreed with the idea that it was now time to move on from the scandal. I think an opinion poll has also found similar, using an even harder wording to agree with a majority disagreeing with that premise. And even not only is it wrong, but it's also if you publicly announce that people shouldn't care about something, they tend to say, what, I think I might look into that a little bit further. So I'm not sure it's the best public communications tactic either.
We're beginning to eat into our last very small number of minutes. Paula, would you like to come in on any of these points?
I'll come in very briefly, but I know you were going to bring Ben in on the sample thing, so I'll leave that one for him to deal with. I was just going to suggest that what I was speaking about previously, about having some kind of battery of what people do, would allow you to address Brian's point, because you'd be able to break results down by types of activists. I mean, whether or not somebody writing it to an MP can be classed as an activist, but you could have some kind of typology of activists, which would allow you to get at that. And the other thing, this is just a kind of throwing it out there, blue skies kind of thinking, was that we've done work a couple of times now surveying MPs on what they think about some of these issues, and it struck me that some of your questions here would go very nicely on an MP survey to compare what the MPs say about some of these issues and what the public say. So that's my kind of maybe for a new round of funding that could find its way in.
Mm-hmm. Alan, I don't know whether you want to take the technical questions yourself, or whether you've been chatting to Ben and want to bring him in. But I'll leave you with the last word, basically. Ben
is definitely the expert on that, but I'm also conscious of the fact that we have 1 minute left. So and clearly we have a sample from YouGov that includes people from all sorts of different backgrounds, and there are some inequalities within that, but we can weight the sample in order to address those in the overall results. Ben might want to add a sentence or two to that. The other thing that I would just add is we have the two parts of the project. We have the surveys, and we also have the citizens' assembly. And the citizens' assembly was recruited through an entirely different process, in which people randomly selected addresses received letters through the post, no internet involved at that stage. And as people will see when the results of that come out in the spring, they're quite similar actually in many ways. And people are able to get to deeper understanding of the issues through the Citizens' Assembly, but there are very few points where there's kind of contradiction in the views that come out of the Assembly versus the survey. So we kind of have a validation exercise, if you like, through a different methodology there.
We now have Ben Lauderdale. It's lovely to have an excuse to bring him onto the screen in front of his appreciative public for doing so much behind the scenes on this poll. Ben, would you like to respond to what Christine has said? I see she just put in the chat, you can't wait for what you haven't got. That's wait as in
yes,
waiting a survey.
and that's exactly right. I mean, surveys have throughout history and throughout sort of different patterns of survey methodology struggled to get at all subpopulations equally and some subpopulations entirely. And even with face-to-face surveys, you can struggle to find certain kinds of people who live less settled lives, and phones have become less and less capable of contacting the many people who will never pick up their phone for an unfamiliar number. And so they're really the key questions around the likely biases and their magnitudes. And I think the two populations that were highlighted were sort of ethnic minority populations and populations of people who are not online. I guess I would suggest that given what we know about those who are not online and those who are in minority ethnic populations, we are probably, if anything, overstating trust in government, where we're sort of looking at absolute levels. I think we know that, with respect to election results and things like that, YouGov has done reasonably well in the last couple of election cycles. We obviously looked at a number of survey companies when we put this out to tender, but we think for sort of, it's almost surely the case that some of the results we have are some percentage points off on, not just because of sampling variability, but also because of these kinds of biases. But, where we're looking at sort of very clear and striking imbalances and responses, the 75%, 9% example being, one of the more extreme ones, we can be pretty confident that even if we got the perfect sample, we would see something pretty similar. I think there's reason to be worried about small biases, but perhaps not very, very large ones.
Terrific, thank you, Ben. And Ben is a very modest person, and he hasn't got his prof on the screen there. So just to be fair, I should have said this is Professor Ben Lauderdale, who, having put this survey into the field, then was public spirited enough to become our head of department. So he's had a lot on his plate doing this survey, as well as doing so much for the rest of us. Okay, we're in overtime now. So thank you so much, everybody, for attending. Thank you for those very smart questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions. But I'm sure that James has read and absorbed all of them. And if anybody's got suggestions for our future research, we will have logged them. If, of course, you want to communicate to us, just write in and let us know. But huge thanks to all of the members of our panel, particularly Paula and James Johnson, for coming in and speaking to us. And please, everybody, look out for our results. Our next set of results, as Alan said, will be from the Citizens' Assembly, which will be in a couple of months' time, I think. And you'll be getting notification when the recording of this event is available. So it'll be one of our podcasts. So if you've enjoyed it, do share it with your friends and family. And if you're not already on our mailing list for events and publications, do go to our website and sign up so that we can let you know what's coming up next. But for now, thank you to the audience, thank you to the panel, and goodbye for now.